I initially went as a freelancer and then got hired by AP as a local hire. And then the stories started to happen. I met my husband, and I stayed, and one thing led to another, and almost 30 years later, I'm still there.
And how did living and working in that region change the way you saw the Western world?
I think it has made me a little more critical. It has made me a little sad at our lack of understanding in the West and our lack of knowledge in the West for other places and cultures and people. I think in some ways it's been worrisome because of the impact that what is decided in the West has on areas and people far beyond its borders. And when it is much more important and necessary that the West have a better understanding and knowledge and tolerance, it seems to have less.
And what stands out to you the most about the people of Afghanistan and in Pakistan?
I think in both countries, the people have a generosity of spirit that is, for me, inspiring. It also is a good lesson for me to try as well, to be more generous and thoughtful. There's resilience that is there, that is very encouraging, and there's a sense of humor that I love among Afghans and among Pakistanis, and they don't take themselves too seriously, and they don't take many other people too seriously, so it's kind of fun.
And was there a defining moment for you when you knew that you would devote your life to journalism and to reporting?
Not really. I mean, I did go to journalism school. I have to say, it wasn't what I really wanted to do. Because I have an older brother who was a journalist, two older brothers who were journalists. One, the oldest, who was brilliant. I mean, he knew everything, and so the last thing I wanted to do was be in the same profession as him. I got in, and then I got a job. So I guess the defining moment was when somebody hired me.
As a recent graduate, I can say that is a very validating moment.
It's pretty funny. So then I was pretty much devoted as long as they gave me a paycheck. No, I'm just kidding.
And so I had been looking at some of your interviews, and I saw one that you did in which you said that the moment at which you saw the people of Afghanistan as enemies would be the time when you had to leave.
Sure.
Can you explain a little bit of what you meant by that?
Sure. I think too often that when you go into an area and you see the people of that area as potential enemies, maybe you should leave, because how can you do the story? I mean, if you look around and everybody you look at, well, what if this person wants to hurt me, or what if this person, or what if this person, then first you're just incapable of having a conversation with them. You're incapable of asking questions because your questions are motivated by your fear and motivated by your perceptions. And so the day I look at anyone, Afghan, Pakistani, I mean, I was in Lebanon for the war in 2006, I did in Yemen and in Iraq and Central Asia, and the moment I start to see other people as potential enemies, then I stop doing the job that I do. Then what's the point? You can't even have a conversation with the person.
And what role does journalism play in trying to dispel some of the fears and the prejudices that we might have about places that we don't know much about?
Well, we don't do as good of a job as we should to do that, I think, as journalists. Because too often, in my mind, we allow the conversation and the narrative to be controlled by Washington, European capitals, occasionally the Canadian one, and so the understanding isn't, you don't receive an understanding of the people and the place and the environment. Instead, you're getting a response and a reaction to the conversation and the narrative that has begun in Washington, in London, in Paris. So for example, what are the stories in Syria today? How often do you hear about the refugees? It's between Russia and Washington. Who cares? You know, I mean, it's incredible. The story has gone from being about Syria, Syrians, what's going on, who's the opposition, what are they made of, what's going on, to does Obama have to be a little bit stronger to show the Russians? And how about that Putin? He's really given a 1-2. And that's what you're hearing now. So I think that we, as journalists in our profession, we have to look at ourselves and say, you know, we have to not allow the narrative and conversation to be controlled elsewhere. You know, we should be telling the stories from those countries and those places and asking difficult questions. And you're not asking me this question, but I'll tell you.
It's easier for me.
We don't ask difficult questions the way we should because, in a way, I think we're afraid of being judged, you know? I mean, and that is, I think, sort of symptomatic of post 9/11. So you say something about the Taliban, so you like the Taliban then, eh? Is that why you're asking that? You know, you have to worry about that. Or you say, so exactly what threat does Assad present to the United States of America? Oh, really? So you think Assad is a good guy? Is that what you're saying? So I think that these difficult questions that need to be asked and need to be answered aren't really being asked as often as they should, and that's it for me.
So it sounds like we need to be a little bit braver then, is what you're saying.
Yeah, braver and more thoughtful, and not allow Washington and the politicians here dictate the story and the conversation and the narrative.
And you talked about the truck driver story, and that obviously had a lot of implications for how conflict was able to continue in that area, the very logistic mechanics of how a commodity is moved from one place to another. But it was also a story about people, and people whose voices aren't really heard very often. Why is it important for you to seek those stories out?
Because I think it gives you an understanding of the environment in which they live, the understanding of the people. It helps you better understand, the reader better understand what is involved in the logistics of a war. And who's doing that? Who's doing that work? You know, who are those truck drivers? And what does it mean to go from point A to point B in one of these trucks? And what kind of people are they? And the sense of humor that they have. And I mean, really, and I think it then allows the reader to develop some sort of a personal relationship or understanding that you might not otherwise. You know, if you get some sort of straight, you know, okay, this is, you know, and truckers, they're important, and truckers bring fuel to Kandahar, where it's then the American troops, and you tell the American troop story. I think it's very important to know who are those truckers. And I think the reader wants to know as well, you know, but I think we have to go out and get those stories because nobody's going to really ask you for them.
And Dave, can you give us one of the questions from the audience?
Okay, here, let's see. We got a lot of great questions here, and we have some time, so this is going to be good. Here's a question. How did you get your first job? What was that job, and how did you end up in Afghanistan from, I presume, northern Canada?
Yeah, I actually, how did I get my first job? Oh, I applied. It was in northern Canada, Timmins, about 500 miles north of Toronto, where Lord Thompson of Fleet, for newspaper people who might know who Lord Thompson of Fleet is, who owns a lot of newspapers and Reuters now. And his first newspaper that he ever purchased was the Timmins Daily Press and Timmins radio station. So I started working there. And my brother, my oldest brother, who was a reporter when I was in school, said, you know, Kathy, they can't teach you to be a writer. Either you can write or you can't write. And so the idea being, so go get a job. And so I finished, and I went and got a job, and they hired me. And then I moved across Canada, working at different places in Canada before going overseas. Because well, I wanted to go overseas, and I really did. I mean, I come from a very small place in northern Canada. I mean, everything was exciting for me. Toronto was exciting for me. The idea of, the United States was, exciting for me. So I really was, and Western Canada was exciting for me. So but I wanted to know my own country first, and so I traveled across and worked at different places in Canada. And then I sold everything that I owned, and I had always wanted to go to Israel. So I went actually first to Israel, to Haifa, and then to Pakistan, to Peshawar, where the refugees were. And back then the Russians were still in Afghanistan. And I went to Japan for a while because I ran out of money. So I earned money teaching English, and then came back and got a job as a local hire with AP, earning the equivalent of not very much. And loved it. And I mean, I would walk down the streets of Peshawar thinking, man, how lucky am I? I mean, I was just, it was so fun. I mean, everywhere that I went, it was just so much fun. I was just so thrilled to be there.
Okay, well, since we're talking about Afghanistan now and your work there, how has local corruption there affected, if at all, your efforts as a journalist? Did you find that different than in,
Did I make more money than I
say, Canada?
Well, I mean, local corruption doesn't bother me. I mean, for sure there's a great deal of corruption. I did stories on it. President Karzai is an old friend of mine. I known him long before he took over as president, and I used to see him quite regularly initially until I started doing all the corruption stories. And then I didn't have so much luck, and although he was incredible when the shooting happened. I mean, he literally called General Dunford, and got him to act quickly to move on him and I. So he did come through at that point, but he refused to give me an interview before that. So, I mean, the only way that it impacted me was more in terms of the stories that you would do, and then people who would say, okay, they wouldn't see you after because you but the corruption itself.
Okay, so now we get to set aside your reporter hat, take that off, and now you get to put on your editorial commentator hat a little, and which you're probably not used to, but let's stretch a little tonight. So we have a lot of questions here about people wondering, what's the future of Afghanistan? And here's a question, have the trillions of dollars the U.S. spent in Afghanistan made us any safer? Made the world safer? Made the U.S. safer?
Well, I think there's been an unfairness in terms of toward the Afghans, in terms of a lot of money was spent on so-called training of the Afghan army. And really Afghan soldiers were hardly trained. The average length of their training was 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And then they were put out because the idea was that there had to be 300,000 boots on the ground. That was the goal. Now, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, was perhaps spent on getting the boots on the ground, which was the major concern, as opposed to training these poor guys and giving them equipment that would really enable them to fight a real fight. And really they're the ones who are dying, and they're the ones who are really, taking a lot of the flack. And so, while a lot of money was spent, that doesn't necessarily translate into good performance or safer safety as a result. I think the Afghan war, I think the war in Afghanistan was limited because the U.S. went to Iraq immediately after. And that war in Iraq has made everybody in the world much more unsafe. And that really, the roots of the insecurity today, it lies in that war.
So what do people in the U.S. not understand about the Taliban in your...
Most everything. Just kidding. Sorry. We don't understand the Taliban. The Taliban first now is sort of a generic term. Anybody who's a militant is a Taliban. So there's and in fact, the Taliban pre-2001 were really village mullahs who ended up imposing village law over the entire country, basically. They certainly have morphed into a different phenomena today, with a lot of young people who are in the mountains and ready to fight and want to continue to fight because they feel that they can win. The Taliban are not the same all over. The practices of the Taliban during their time in power, while offensive to many in terms of girls not being allowed to school, public execution, you have to keep in mind, and repressive legislation, particularly vis-a-vis women. There are certainly countries in the world that are allies of the U.S. who have much more repressive practices. Public executions are carried out every Friday in Saudi Arabia, which is a strong ally. So I think the Taliban became sort of like this overwhelming entity that everybody could hate without really understanding, because they are horrible people who hate women and blah, blah, blah. And whereas it's a much more nuanced movement, it's different in Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban are different than the ones who were pre-2001 in Afghanistan. It's gotten further complicated because you have ISIS people now in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are fighting them, so how do you differentiate between the two? I mean, so it's become a much more complicated movement, but the pre-2001 Taliban who ran Afghanistan were basically village mullahs who had no desire to spread their version of anything beyond their own borders. Were they repressive? For sure. They imposed village life over the entire country. And that was what was very, very difficult for people to understand and to deal with. And so people were certainly happy to see the back of them after 2001, but then the coalition brought in all those people who had been in power between 1992 and 1996 and had themselves killed over 50,000 Afghans when they last ruled. So I think this is a long answer to your, it's a very nuanced and what is known about the Taliban, I think is very little, and it's very generalized, and it's really just, they've been reduced to a evil entity.
So do you see a future of stability in Afghanistan? Is that ever going to come, and what role does the U.S. play in that? Will the U.S. ever be out of there?
Well, I mean, I think that's, in my mind, and this is just, just because you're there doesn't mean that you're doing a good job. And just because you're there doesn't mean that we were there, so how come it's not better? I think, and that's not just the U.S., it was a coalition, it was 42 countries. So, I think what really has to be looked at is what the heck was done in all this time by 42 countries that it is such a mess today. So to say, gee, the Afghans should say thank you very much for staying. Well, yeah, they want you to stay because it's already, it's such a mess. They're afraid for what's going to happen tomorrow. I think there has to be a thought to, gee, what were the mistakes that were made? What kind of training should be done? How do you help the Afghans be self-sufficient. They are very capable of being self-sufficient. But when they first went in, Rumsfeld said, no nation building. It was a country that was destroyed by almost 30 years of war. No nation building. That was not part of the agenda. The UN said a light footprint. There was no institution, so there was no heavy involvement in doing all those things. So when would the US be able to leave? I'm not sure, you know, I mean, will there be stability in Afghanistan anytime soon? I think, you know, as Noor is here from Afghanistan, poor thing. You know, I mean, it's hard to know what's going to happen in Afghanistan tomorrow, and I think many Afghans are afraid. Many Afghans are angry and frustrated because they wanted more. And they are able, they are capable people. It's not that, gee, after 14 years, good Lord, we gave them billions of dollars and went in there to really help, and here they are, they still can't manage. Well, they are capable, and they are able to do things. But when the coalition went in, it didn't go in very well prepared, and it didn't do a heck of a lot to focus in on a real constructive effort to help Afghans make things better. That is very much a personal thing that I say so.
Thank you. And by the way, you mentioned Noor in the back there. Raise your hand, Noor. From Afghanistan, he helped us. He's a translator. He helped Professor Maggie Zenger and many of our professors set up a journalism program in Afghanistan at a university there. And hopefully we can help in that way if anything.
And that's going gangbusters, eh?
The program's taking off. I think they have more majors than we do now, right? So now that that's right. So you're headed back to Afghanistan in January, right? You're back on the job. What do you plan to do? What's your reporting goal? What are you going to cover? Why are you going back? What are you going to do?
I'm going back because that's where I live and what I want to do, because I don't want to be defined by the shooting, you know. I mean, there's lots of stories I want to do in Afghanistan. There are lots of stories I want to do in Pakistan. I'm already trying to put together some stories about climate change in Pakistan, and there's some very interesting things being done in terms of trying to understand the real cycle of heavy flooding and drought that's going on, and so I'm planning on going down into the south in Sindh. In Afghanistan, I'd like to do some stories on the militias and the use of them, and there has been some good work done already on some of that, and I'd like to do more. I'd like to go down in the south and find out what's really happening down there in terms of the growing influence and control by the Taliban. I want very much to go back to Host to see the doctor who operated on me when I first came to Host from tonight where the shooting occurred, and he literally saved my life. And he's an Afghan doctor at a hospital that is has the very basics, and he took me in and he just said, you have to stop the bleeding. And one of the bullets had shattered my shoulder blade and punctured my lung, and they also had to inflate the lung as well, but also the bleeding was so. And just before we went in, he said, I just want you to know, your life is as important to me as it is to you. And in an attempt to try to comfort me and so I want to go back there. I want to go back there for my own personal, to say thank you, and to really amazing, and because I think it's very important for me and for Anja that I go back.
Great. Here's a question from Barbara Walters. So I guess you seem like a dedicated journalist. But if you weren't a journalist, what would you be doing? And
Unemployed.
Unemployed, of course. But what do you like to do? What made you laugh? What makes you cry? Who are you beyond the journalist in you?
I'm a lot of things, I mean, we have a wonderful life in Pakistan. My husband's an architect. architect, he has an art gallery, we have friends who do interesting and fun things. I like to travel. I have a wonderful collection of friends in Pakistan, in Canada. I have family there. I've got, you know, I mean, I have a wonderful life, so beyond my, you know, I mean, we have a farm. We want to together, my husband and I, we want to start a peace center in Pakistan. That's sort of the goal. Most everything is to launch a peace center, and we've already started doing some research into it, and the Peace Center the Pakistan has a Nobel laureate, Abdul Salam, who won the Nobel in chemistry, and we want to champion these peace activists throughout the region, in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and so that's a very big goal that we're embarking on. So yeah, I've got pretty fine life.
Well, that's great. Final question. So what advice would you give to current journalism students here in the audience, and anybody else for that matter?
Well, you know, I wait for you to ask me. And I think if I were starting out, for me, we're reporters. That's what we are as journalists. We ask questions. And I think there are such, whether you cover City Hall, or, and I said this over and over, the police beat, or Education Board, or Afghanistan, or Yemen, or Lebanon, you have to have the fundamental skills of asking questions, being curious, building contacts. I mean, I think you have to have a real passion for that, and so for journalists, I mean, I guess I find it very, it makes me nervous when somebody says, well, you know, I want to be a war correspondent. You know, first, I'm not a war correspondent, I'm a correspondent, I'm a reporter. I cover wars, but I cover them in the same way that I covered City Hall or the courts. I make good contacts, regardless of who it is, whether it was the Taliban, whether it was with Karzai's people, whether it was with the Pakistani government, whether it's with you make good contacts so that you can try to give as broad a story as you can. So I guess I would say, you know, if you've got a real passion for asking questions and being curious, and then it's a great job for you. And that's it. And good luck.
Thank you. Mariana, how about you take us home?
Yeah. So, thank you again for your words and for sharing this time with us this evening. And so I think we've all been able to see from tonight and from our own personal experiences that journalism is a lens through which we can see the world in different ways. It's a magnifying glass that lets us look at the community around us much closer and in greater detail. And it's a telescope that lets us see worlds that are far away from our own. And I think what we've also seen is that great journalists, while they might have some inborn talent, they're not born. They have to be taught. And they have to be taught in places like this School of Journalism. And to do that takes money. And so if you've been inspired by what you've heard this evening, I would encourage you to think about making a donation to the School of Journalism. There's some envelopes on your tables. There'll be people with laptops at the doors. And thank you. Yes, we have you. You can't leave. We have people all over us.
So you're not leaving until you get
Really. But thank you for joining us this evening and for sharing this time with the people at your tables, with the journalism students, and with Kathy here. And I've also been obligated to tell you that you should drive safely on the way home.